Donald Trump needed just 2 words this morning to make clear to everyone exactly how he plans to react to the Supreme Court decision declaring his tariffs unlawful. Absolute right. No detailed legal reasoning, no restrained reply to the justice's conclusions, no commitment to respect the constitutional limits the founders put in place. Absolute right. 2 words shared in the middle of the night that instantly informed Canada, the courts, and every allied country following this clash all they needed to understand about what happens next. Mark Carney had his answer prepared before most of Washington had even finished processing the overnight reactions. Let me point out something that many people reporting on this aren't pausing long enough to make clear. What unfolded last night between Donald Trump and the Supreme Court of the United States goes far beyond a routine legal step in a trade fight. It marks a genuine constitutional turning point. A moment when the leader of the world's most powerful country publicly declared to the nation's highest judicial body, the very institution the founders created specifically to prevent this sort of executive excess, that it was incompetent, shameful, lacking proper allegiance, and that he intended to proceed however he pleased regardless. That is not merely a comment about trade policy. That is a direct statement about whether any legal limits actually bind this president. And every government around the globe, Canada included, is now adjusting its calculations based on how that question gets answered. A president who brushes aside Supreme Court decisions with midnight social media posts is not a president whose future actions are shaped by what the court decided. He is a president whose future actions are shaped only by what he thinks he can pull off without serious pushback. Carney gets this completely. Ottawa has been gearing up for precisely this version of the showdown since the opening days of the trade conflict. And what Canada rolled out today was never just a reply to a couple of late-night words. It was the launch of a carefully constructed legal, diplomatic, and economic plan built specifically for the scenario in which the American constitutional system no longer serves as a dependable brake on executive power. Back in February, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the legal tool the Trump administration had relied on to place wide-ranging tariffs on nations worldwide, Canada among them, did not actually authorize those tariff actions. The 1977 statute was written explicitly to handle real national security crises involving hostile foreign powers. The justices concluded that stretching it to cover broad tariffs on friendly democratic trade partners went beyond the authority Congress had provided. The decision wasn't some minor technical correction. It was a core finding that the president had misused an emergency power for an objective the statute never permitted. It nullified tariff measures that had formed the backbone of the administration's trade strategy for months, and it delivered something legal experts quickly flagged as carrying weight well outside the immediate trade dispute. It confirmed that presidential emergency economic powers face constitutional boundaries the courts will actually uphold. The administration's reaction to that decision revealed far more about its approach to governing than any official trade policy paper ever could. Trump branded the court entirely inept and humiliating. He charged that it had needlessly damaged the United States. He implied the justices had not demonstrated adequate loyalty to him. And then he insisted he possesses the absolute right to levy fresh tariffs using other legal pathways. On social media, he claimed the Supreme Court's own ruling had affirmed his absolute right to impose tariffs through alternative means. Here is the vital point everyone following this standoff needs to grasp plainly. The Supreme Court's ruling said nothing of the kind. The court did not endorse Trump's absolute right to charge tariffs in some other form. It ruled only that the particular authority he had invoked was misapplied and therefore invalid. It remained silent on whether other authorities existed without restriction. Trump's portrayal of the decision as validating his absolute rights was never a serious legal reading. It was a political assertion delivered at midnight to convey strength despite a clear legal setback. And it was precisely the sort of assertion that Carney, who has spent decades working in places where the line between genuine legal power and mere political rhetoric is measured in billions, spotted instantly for what it truly was. Grasping what happens next means understanding the legal terrain the Supreme Court decision left behind for the administration. The main tariff authority has vanished. The administration rushed to place 10% tariffs on goods from large parts of the world under a different statute, Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. But those Section 122 tariffs automatically expire after 150 days. That deadline arrives in July. The president promised to lift them to 15%, but has not followed through yet. American officials opened several new trade investigations last week, aiming to lay groundwork for lasting tariffs under other statutory powers. Yet trade investigations demand time. They involve formal procedures. They face potential legal challenges. And they cannot deliver the same instant blanket coverage the emergency authority once offered before the court invalidated it. What the administration is now trying to assemble in a matter of weeks is a trade enforcement structure that originally required months to construct, using legal tools that each come with their own procedural restrictions, on a schedule that ends in July, against adversaries who have spent the past 6 months examining every possible American tariff law and crafting targeted strategies to contest each one. Canada stands as the best prepared of those adversaries, and the 150-day period created by the Section 122 tariffs before they lapse is a period Ottawa has been studying, strategizing around, and getting ready to exploit ever since the Supreme Court challenge began months earlier. At 11:43 this morning, Mark Carney stepped in front of reporters in Ottawa. He had been up since the midnight posts. His team had been dissecting the legal picture created by the Supreme Court ruling and the administration's reaction to it since well before dawn. What he presented was never a knee-jerk reaction. It was the activation of a strategy Canada had been constructing specifically for the legal and constitutional reality that last night's developments had now confirmed was in effect. Carney began by speaking plainly and directly about the Supreme Court ruling so any ordinary observer could follow. He noted that America's highest court had determined the tariffs placed on Canada exceeded the legal power Congress had granted the president. He emphasized that this ruling matters, not because Canada requires validation from an American court for its own stance, which has remained legally steady from the start, but because it confirms exactly what Canada has maintained since the first tariff landed. The pressure effort against Canada never rested on firm legal ground. It rested on an expansive reading of emergency powers that the American constitutional order has now officially rejected. Then Carney tackled the absolute right claim with the sharpness of someone who understands exactly how legal authority actually functions. There is no absolute right in a constitutional democracy, he said. There are statutory powers legislatures confer. There are constitutional limits courts enforce. There are international treaty commitments governments accept. And there are the legal rights of sovereign countries to protect their interests using every lawful tool at their disposal. Canada honors all those structures. Canada has stayed inside all those structures throughout this dispute. Canada will keep doing so. And Canada will employ every one of those structures to defend itself against whatever new tariff measure the administration pursues through whatever legal channel it selects next. He then outlined 3 concrete steps taken immediately that together formed Canada's strategic reply to the changed legal environment. The first was the official broadening of Canada's international legal challenge portfolio. Canada had already been advancing cases through the World Trade Organization, bilateral dispute mechanisms, and additional international venues throughout the conflict. Carney declared that Canada was now submitting a formal addition to the international legal record that specifically records the Supreme Court ruling and explains its consequences for the validity of American tariff measures under global trade rules. The submission contended that the American court's own conclusion that emergency economic powers were improperly used against allied trading partners bolsters the case for international rulings against any tariff relying on the same authority. Canada was turning the American court's decision into an instrument in the global legal arena. It had been ready to do exactly that since the initial challenge was launched. The second step was the triggering of what Carney called Canada's Legal Transition Response Framework. This consisted of ready-made economic and trade policy measures crafted especially for the interval when American tariff authority shifts between the now invalid emergency powers and whatever substitute statutory tools the administration manages to assemble. The framework included speeding up the completion of Canadian export redirection deals, fast-tracking domestic production investment initiatives, and intensifying outreach to allied trading partners to secure commercial ties during the period of American tariff instability. The reasoning was sharp and intentional. The 150-day window before Section 122 tariffs expire represents a phase of relative American trade enforcement vulnerability. Canada intends to use every single day of it to push forward the structural trade diversification it has been developing throughout the entire conflict. The third step was a direct communication sent to partners in Canada's Allied Economic Resilience Network, updating them on the legal developments, the 150-day timeline, and Ottawa's evaluation of how the administration will probably try to rebuild its tariff authority using trade investigations and Section 232 national security provisions. The message encouraged partner countries to align their own legal and economic countermeasures against American tariff rebuilding efforts, so the administration encounters steady, well-documented international resistance no matter which legal path it pursues. The network Canada had deliberately constructed for precisely this type of synchronized response was now being deployed with the exactness and timing that months of groundwork had enabled. Here is the core insight Washington prefers to keep quiet. The midnight posts, the absolute right declarations, and the attacks on the court are actually revealing the true condition of this trade standoff if you know how to interpret them properly. Governments that are prevailing in trade disputes do not lash out at their own Supreme Courts at midnight. They do not feel compelled to assert absolute rights the courts have just restricted. They do not hurry to rebuild trade enforcement systems through fallback legal channels on deadlines that are already counting down. They advance their agenda from a place of legal certainty, institutional strength, and strategic advantage. None of those three elements describe the administration's situation this morning. What the midnight posts actually signal is a president who absorbed a major legal loss, recognized that the loss opened a period of weakness in his trade enforcement power, and countered by broadcasting fierce confidence through social media, because fierce confidence is the single tool that requires no legal grounding to use. The posts were never a legal plan. They were a messaging plan meant to stop any appearance of weakness from hardening into genuine weakness before the administration could rebuild its legal footing. Carney recognized them for exactly that right away, because he has built his career in environments where the distinction between displayed confidence and real legal authority determines outcomes when actual money and actual sovereignty hang in the balance. And what Ottawa set in motion today was engineered specifically to capitalize on the difference between what Trump asserted at midnight and what the legal reality actually permits when morning arrives. The 150-day timer is now ticking. The trade investigation started last week will require months before they yield usable tariff powers. Section 232 national security tariffs demand Commerce Department determinations that take time and remain open to the same kinds of legal challenges that toppled the emergency authority. Every legal option the administration has left to reassemble its tariff structure carries procedural steps, deadlines, and legal exposures that were absent when the emergency power stood intact. Canada has examined every option closely. Ottawa has legal contest strategies ready for every option. And the commercial and diplomatic ties Canada has cultivated throughout this dispute are being solidified during this window of enforcement vulnerability before the administration can reconstruct what the court dismantled. Let me outline three possible paths forward. In the first path, the trade investigations begun last week generate Section 232 national security findings inside 60 days, enabling the administration to apply new permanent tariffs on Canadian goods through a legal channel that has traditionally withstood court scrutiny. Canada contests the national security rationale through every available international and domestic legal avenue at once. The legal contest stretches across multiple court layers over 12 to 18 months. Canada's economy keeps diversifying throughout the prolonged legal uncertainty. By the point final rulings emerge, the structural shifts in Canadian trade relationships have progressed enough that any tariff measures leverage has shrunk substantially compared with where it stood when the confrontation began. In the second path, the 150-day Section 122 window closes before the administration manages to build a replacement tariff structure with comparable scope. A stretch of sharply reduced American tariff pressure on Canada opens room for diplomatic talks. The Allied Economic Resilience Network coordination and the commercial relationship anchoring Canada is now accelerating, create lasting trade diversification during that interval. Negotiations commence from a place where Canada's economic resilience has strengthened considerably and the administration's legal standing has weakened considerably. An agreement emerges that is significantly more advantageous to Canadian interests than anything the administration's initial pressure campaign aimed to achieve. In the third path, Trump's assaults on the Supreme Court and his absolute right assertions speed up a broader constitutional crisis inside the United States that reaches well beyond the trade dispute with Canada. Members of Congress from both parties who have observed the administration's handling of constitutional limits start coordinating legislative measures to safeguard oversight of tariff authority. The international community that has tracked the confrontation reaches conclusions about American institutional dependability that extend past trade policy into investment decisions, alliances, and diplomatic ties. Canada's choice to strengthen resilient, independent institutions throughout this dispute positions it as a steady and dependable partner precisely when American institutional reliability faces the greatest doubt. The trade war Canada has endured becomes the platform for Canada's most substantial growth in international partnerships in decades. Absolute right. Two words that communicated more about the present condition of this trade confrontation than any press statement, tariff list, or official policy paper the administration has issued in the past 6 months. They revealed that the central legal authority has disappeared, that the substitute authorities are short-lived and restricted, that the administration's answer to legal defeat is attack and declaration rather than adaptation and adherence, and that the president believes broadcasting confidence at midnight can replace the legal foundation a court just eliminated. Carney had his response lined up before Washington even finished absorbing the overnight reactions. Because the response was never crafted for two midnight words. It was crafted for what those words actually signified. The moment American tariff authorities' legal structure entered a phase of real exposure, the moment the 150-day countdown began on the administration's last remaining broad tariff power, the moment Canada's 6 months of preparation located the vulnerability it had been designed to target. 2 words at midnight. 6 months of preparation in Ottawa, 150 days on the clock. And a constitutional confrontation that has moved beyond trade alone. It is now about whether legal constraints apply to this president at all. Canada has its answer to that question fully developed, and it doesn't need a midnight post to make it clear.